The acrid scent of burnt metal and ozone hung heavy in the air. Sergeant Maddox, his face streaked with grime and blood, gripped his pulse rifle, its cooling vents hissing like a wounded beast. Around him, the remnants of his squad, 4 men out of the original 12, huddled behind the mangled remains of a transport vehicle. The battle had been raging for hours, a relentless tide of chitinous horror washing against their desperate defense. "Report," Maddox barked, his voice raspy. Corporal Thorne, a young man whose usual cheer was replaced by a grim determination, adjusted his scope. "Still pouring out of the tunnels, Sarge. Looks like they've got a few of those heavy units coming up now." He didn't need to elaborate. They all knew what heavy meant. Towering, armored monstrosities that could shrug off pulse rounds like rain. The Skith, the insectoid species that had declared war on humanity with chilling indifference, were relentless. "Medkit, Sergeant," muttered Vargas, a medic with a stoic face that belied his trembling hands. He was trying to bandage a gaping wound on Private Cole's leg, the boy's face pale and drawn. "Save it," Maddox said, his eyes scanning the battlefield. "Cole's beyond us. Focus on Thorne and me." Cole's breathing was shallow, his eyes fixed on something beyond the present. He had been a good soldier, one of the best. Maddox clenched his jaw, pushing down the grief, knowing that even a moment's hesitation could mean the end for them all. "Incoming!" Thorne yelled, his voice sharp, snapping Maddox back to the present. The ground vibrated as the Skith heavies emerged from the tunnels, their segmented limbs scraping against the rock. They were like mobile fortresses, each one armed with a brutal array of scything claws and plasma cannons. The squad opened fire, the pulse rifles spitting bolts of searing energy. The standard rounds bounced harmlessly off the heavies' chitinous plating, their plasma cannons answering with devastating blasts that carved chunks of rock and metal out of the landscape. "We need to fall back, Sergeant," Thorne yelled, his voice tight with fear. "We can't hold them here." Maddox shook his head. "No, we hold. This is the line." They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered, but he knew they couldn't retreat. Behind them lay a chokepoint, a bottleneck where even more Skith were funneling through. If they broke, the whole sector might fall. "You hear that?" Vargas said, pointing a shaking finger towards the horizon. A low rumble echoed through the battlefield, growing louder with each passing second. Maddox felt a glimmer of hope, a faint spark in the darkness. Reinforcements were coming, but they were too far away. They wouldn't arrive in time. The only question that remained was how long they could hold this line. He gripped his pulse rifle tighter. "Thorne, flank the right side. Vargas, cover the center. I'll try to draw their fire." Thorne nodded, his face resolute. Vargas moved into position, his eyes darting from target to target, his rifle spitting short, controlled bursts. Maddox surged forward, his body a coiled spring. He knew the odds were impossible, but something inside him, a primal fury, drove him onward. He charged directly towards the closest heavy, firing his rifle at its exposed joints, trying to find a weak point, an opening. The Skith turned, its multiple eyes fixing on Maddox, a low hiss emanating from its mandibles. He felt no fear, only the burning need to survive, to protect his men, to make the enemy pay. The heavy lumbered towards him, a wall of claws and armor. Maddox dived to the side as a plasma bolt seared the ground where he had stood. The shock wave threw him against the transport wreckage. He felt his ribs crack, a sharp pain that shot up through his torso, but he ignored it, rolling back to his feet, his rifle raised. He emptied another magazine, hissing with frustration as the rounds still failed to penetrate. Thorne, meanwhile, was using his sniper rifle with pinpoint accuracy, taking down drones and smaller Skiths with cold precision. Vargas, behind cover, continued to lay down suppressive fire, keeping the smaller units at bay. But the heavies were the problem. They were relentless, uncaring. Maddox felt a sharp, agonizing pain as one of the heavy's claws grazed his shoulder, sending his rifle clattering to the ground. He gritted his teeth, drawing his combat knife, the cold steel a welcome comfort in the face of death. He knew he couldn't win this fight, but he wouldn't go down without a fight. He'd make them pay in blood for every inch they took. He dodged another swipe of the heavy's claw, its razor-sharp edge whistling past his face. He lunged forward, his combat knife aimed at the joint where the chitin plates met, the only vulnerable spot he could see. He struck true, feeling a small resistance before the blade bit deep. The heavy let out a screech of pain, its massive form shaking as its limbs thrashed uncontrollably. He twisted the blade further, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder. He was a hurricane of fury and determination. A mortal man who had somehow found a way to defy death. The heavy finally toppled, crashing to the ground with a deafening thud. But there were still more coming. More monsters from the darkness. Maddox retrieved his pulse rifle, his body aching, his breath ragged. He saw Thorn and Vargas were still firing, their ammunition nearly depleted. He looked at them, his eyes filled with a grim determination. He was going to die here. He knew it. But he was going to take as many of these monsters with him as he could. He opened fire once more, screaming a defiant roar, a primal challenge to the darkness that sought to consume them. "They're breaking!" Thorn yelled. His voice was filled with surprise and disbelief. The tide of the Skids' assault began to falter, their attack losing momentum. The heavies that had been lumbering so resolutely forward were slowing, becoming hesitant. Vargas moved to Maddox's side, applying a field dressing to his shoulder, his hands moving with newfound speed. He looked at Maddox with a mixture of awe and terror. What did you do?" Maddox leaned against the remains of the transport, his chest heaving. "I fought them." Sanchez opened his eyes and smiled. "Glad to save you." "I know I did." It wasn't a boast, but a statement of fact. He hadn't done anything special. He had just kept fighting. He had refused to yield. He had faced death head-on and told it with every fiber of his being, "Not today." The Skith were retreating, their forces faltering and disorganized. The rumble of approaching reinforcements grew louder, the earth shaking with the arrival of human tanks and armored vehicles. A few moments later, a rescue team rushed to their position. They were awestruck by the scene before them, the mangled wreckage of the transport, the torn and shattered bodies of the Skith, and 4 exhausted, bloodied soldiers who had held the line when all hope had seemed lost. The rescue team medics quickly stabilized Cole and then immediately focused on Maddox and Thorn, before moving to Vargas. While they were treating the men, they had begun to ask questions, wanting to know how 4 men had held off such a relentless assault. "They were scared," Thorn murmured, looking in disbelief at the retreating Skith, his words sounding distant, almost like he didn't believe them himself. "Scared?" one of the rescue team members said, laughing slightly. It was an understandable response when faced with a situation like this. "Yeah, scared," Thorn said firmly. "I saw it in their eyes. They stopped, hesitated. They've never seen anyone fight like that before." "It's the will to survive," Vargas interjected. "We've got something they don't. They fight as a unit, we fight as individuals even with a unified cause." Maddox didn't say anything, he was too exhausted, but he knew what Thorn and Vargas meant. He had felt it himself. It wasn't that they were fearless, it was that their fear did not paralyze them. They had felt fear, the cold grip of dread and despair, but they had pushed past it, fueled by an indomitable will to survive, to protect, to fight. That was something the Skith had not understood. They were a species used to overwhelming force, to precise execution of tactical plans. They had never faced an enemy that refused to be broken by the horrors of war. They hadn't prepared for the sheer, terrifying tenacity of humanity. Maddox was hauled onto a stretcher, his body screaming in protest. As he was carried away, he looked back at the battlefield, at the line they had held. He saw the dead Skith, their segmented bodies scattered across the ground. He saw the wreckage of the transport, the blood-soaked earth. And he knew in that moment that they had done something extraordinary, something that no other species had ever achieved. They had proven beyond any doubt the indomitable strength of human will. Later, in the medbay, Maddox lay in a sterile bed, his body aching but his spirit somehow renewed. He had survived. His men had survived. And the line, that tiny sliver of land on a far-flung battlefield, had been held because of them. A battle and a war that had been won because they had kept fighting and, in the end, scared the enemy into retreat. The battle had been won, not because of superior weapons or numbers, but because of something the Skith could never understand: the human capacity to push past the limits of pain and fear, an unyielding resolve in the face of death. And ultimately, that is what made humans terrifying. The galaxy might have underestimated humanity. They might have seen them as just another species, weak and insignificant. But they had made a terrible mistake. The humans had just begun to fight, and they wouldn't be broken. The news of their stand echoed through the human ranks, becoming a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope. Maddox, Thorne, Vargas, and even the fallen Cole became heroes, their story a testament to human resilience. And the Skith, for the first time, realized what it truly meant to face a foe that could not be broken. The unbroken line had been drawn, and the galaxy would never be the same.